My name is Saul Wordsworth, and this is the IVT Podcast. Hello, I'm Saul Wordsworth, Deputy Editor of IVT International, the world's leading publication for industrial and off-road vehicles in construction, agriculture and mining. Welcome to the IVT Podcast. What a difference a month makes. 4 weeks ago, when I recorded the previous podcast, the industry was gearing up for ConExpo. I was there. On the street, it was business as usual, or as usual as business gets in Las Vegas. At the show, there was greater awareness of Covid-19, but aside from the odd European, people were generally greeting one another in the time-honoured fashion. The event ended a day early. Now, 19 days later, a fifth of the global population is in some form of lockdown, and the world and world economy is in a state of turmoil, the likes of which few have seen since World War II. These are unprecedented, fast-moving times, and most of us are struggling to keep up. But that doesn't mean we can't try to raise your spirits as well as inform you. And despite what is undoubtedly an exceptionally challenging period, there are chinks of light within the industry. Whilst the likes of JCB and Manitou Group have suspended production until the end of the month, engine manufacturer Cummins and Italian forklift OEM Mariotti are among those keeping production lines rolling, albeit with new working practices. Meanwhile, Wacker Neuson's Chinese site has resumed activities, with procedures regarding procurement, production and sales increasingly normalising. China appears to be coming out of what Europe is in the midst of. We have a couple of interviews for you exploring how Covid-19 is already impacting and will affect the industry. The first is with Riccardo Viaggi, Secretary General of CECE, which represents the national interests of European construction equipment manufacturers. The second features Ken Simonson, Chief Economist with the Associated General Contractors of America. I warn you, both shoot from the hip. But before we get to the interviews, let's look back briefly at ConExpo 2020. Despite a handful of withdrawals, visitors still flooded to Las Vegas Conference Center from the 9th to the 13th of March. Registered attendance was up 1.5% on 2017, while total buyer attendance improved by 5%. Business was conducted, booths were packed, and 75,000 attended the education sessions. Highlights included the unveiling of the new Case Concept fully electric backhoe loader, a video of which you'll find on our website, the Caterpillar live shows and Global Challenge, and the extraordinary array of machines on display at the exhibition grounds, in particular the plethora of skyscraping cranes. But don't take my word for it, here's what those at the show thought, starting with David Price, Global Marketing Manager of Hydroforce and Chairman of the Fluid Power arm of the show.
Yeah, show's been good for us. The traffic that is here, they want to be here, and it's been steady. And all the conversations we've had in our booth have been fantastic. And couldn't really ask for better conversations on the booth. In terms of the event still continuing to go on, this is not going so well. It's like a maelstrom. Okay. I am personally glad it went on because, like I mentioned, the people that we've talked to that have been here have been fantastic conversations and should lead to business development.
My favorite thing is actually I've seen a lot of very technical stuff here. I mean, equipment and very high-end, high technical, product here to be shown. So I feel kind of very excited about, so many people are interested in high-tech supported kind of product or equipment.
I really like the electric backhoe loader case.
There's literally every piece of equipment that a person would ever imagine out here. A wonderful place to visit.
I like the hot dogs best.
Now it's time for the main event. So sit back, if you're not already sitting back, relax if you're not relaxed, and listen to our two feature interviews. We begin with the outlook for European construction equipment manufacturers with Riccardo Viaggi, Secretary General of CC.
I'd like to kick things off by asking you how you think the industrial construction vehicle industry will be affected both in the short and the long term.
Well, the effects short term from the coronavirus outbreak are going to be serious. They are already being experimented and being felt in certain European countries, of course, with Italy having the hit for the first time and for the longest period right now. The closest and more direct effect short term is, of course, some factories shutting down. This is the result of government-imposed measures on non-essential sectors. This is already happening in industrial strongholds in the northern Italy, with regions like Lombardy, Veneto, and Emilia-Romagna very strongly hit by those measures. So this is the first short-term effect that we are seeing. This has a rippling effect on other countries and on the overall construction equipment and construction machinery industry, because those regions are in fact producing a lot of components for machinery. We have already had an exchange of views within CECE, within my association, where first of all, the supply chain disruptions, which we have experienced already for a few months in China, are now somewhat being resolved, with factories picking up activity again. But there are new disruptions already coming up with the northern Italy industrial parts, and furthermore, as soon as new countries, new member states of the European Union, or new European countries in general, follow the same measures as Italy has imposed, those supply chain disruptions will be felt even more hardly.
So would you say that production has shut down more or less in Europe?
Well, sir, I cannot say that because the situation is really national to a certain extent, and even more local to other extents.
Sure.
So even regions in the same country do not behave in the same way, because in certain countries, luckily the majority of them yet, production has not been shut down by government decree, which was the case in Italy. But of course, as with other measures of health character or economic character, well, we know that the rule book Italy is using is sooner or later going to apply to other countries. Hopefully not all of them, because that means that the spread is contained, but most likely to many of them. And of course, there are already discussions about construction sites closing down. And by definition, if it's not because of the supply chain disruptions, if the construction sites are closing down, there's no more demand. And that leads me to the longer term effects of this. We already, let's say, we come from an optimistic market conditions. 2019 was, again, a positive year in terms of market sales, but we know that demand for construction equipment will slow down. It will slow down significantly, of course, way beyond the double digit. In some countries of our CC members already foreseeing a drop around 50%. Of course, supply will shrink significantly. First of all, as as a consequence of lagging demand, but also as a direct consequence of what we talked about before: supply chain disruptions and factories shutting down completely. We, of course, are working to prevent the most severe impacts of this, so making sure that those shutdowns are only temporary, that the demand can pick up as quickly as possible with a host of policy actions, investment push, and liquidity injections within the economy, so that the activity can pick up again and the most severe part of the health emergency is resolved.
So you're talking about measures taken at a national level. What about, for instance, your organisation, CECE? What can you and other organisations do you think, to help the industry get back on its feet?
Yeah, well, there are indeed a lot of actions, as you rightly say, that are national. They are of national character. I'm certainly thinking about any sort of fiscal and tax incentives. Those are purely national. There is absolutely no power, no competence with the EU on this. There is, in any way, a wish that we as European associations made of national industry organizations make, is that there is some form of coordination at European level of these actions. Not only because the European Union is one single economic bloc, but also because a lot of our members are international companies, multinational companies, and they need these actions to be coordinated as much as possible. But there are indeed areas of action where the EU is leading. For example, thinking about ensuring that the single market continues to work proficiently without any unneeded barriers. And this, of course, is aimed at limiting further supply chain disruptions, further to the ones that we have. For example, with machines or components being blocked at borders, which have unfortunately gone up again in certain European member countries, so that we are at least able to do the part of the work, the part of the job that we can do. Of course, always preserving health and safety of everyone involved.
Of course.
In this. There is one very specific action which I wanted to point out. Indeed, as CC, we have just issued a very specific request to the European Union in their power as a legislator, as a regulator. As everybody knows, on the 1st of January, the Stage 5 regulation entered into force. We are now in what we call the transition phase, and this transition phase is the key moment for certain engines to be placed on completed machine and then to be placed on the European market. These deadlines are close to come. So on the 30th of June or on the 31st of December of 2020. Okay. We have officially asked for the European Commission to consider postponing those deadlines. This is a much needed moratorium on the application of certain regulation deadlines, which would cause additional unneeded economic damage, and would also cause substantial resources to go to waste, because if these transition engines cannot be placed on machines and cannot be placed on the market in the near future, they would have to be scrapped. And scrapping thousands of engines means a lot of resources and materials to be wasted.
What advice would you give to those listening to this podcast? Do you have any advice, or maybe a message you'd like to convey?
I would like, as much as possible, to advise to treat the situation with numbers, with actual analysis, and try to overcome the understandable anxieties that the situation brings, not only from an economic point of view, but also from an health and society point of view. So as industries, we are expected, I think, to reason with a cool head and try to overcome this, as we have overcome other crises, even if this seems unprecedented, but try to handle this with with reason, with numbers, and of course in coordination with partners and stakeholders as much as possible.
That was Riccardo Viaggi, Secretary General of CC. Next up, Ken Simonson, Chief Economist with the Associated General Contractors of America.
So my first question to you, Ken, is how the current crisis is affecting the construction industry.
Well, construction is an industry that fortunately is able to keep going a little better than some other industries. A lot of the projects obviously take place out in the open. There is a certain amount of distancing, but at the same time, the industry is so integrated with the rest of the economy that it's going to be very difficult to keep going. And construction is an industry that will probably be slower to recover than some others.
What do you envisage the long-term effects of a situation that's like to last for at least 3 to 6 months?
You're right. It will have very long-lasting effects on construction. I think that owners and government agencies, individuals who previously might have been ready to buy a home, all of them are going to be having to look for immediate needs first and put off either a long-term construction project, either because they no longer have the need for it, they don't have the confidence that this is the right thing to do, or they don't have the cash available to start the project. So that's why I think that construction will be slow to come back compared to people going out to shop or recreate right away.
What about the off-road vehicle industry itself? How is that, and will that be impacted by coronavirus?
Well, I think there is some chance that the extraordinary fiscal measures that governments are taking, certainly here in the United States, to inject money into the economy so that we don't have a total collapse of employment, some of that may show up in investment in needed infrastructure. We have been woefully short of the needed investment in highways, in water and sewer systems, many types of infrastructure. And because contractors are able to keep people employed and actually producing things, I'm hopeful that the U.S. government and others will also see the value in putting immediate funds toward that kind of project. That in turn would enable contractors and rental and leasing companies to invest in the equipment needed to produce those new assets.
Okay, thank you, Ken. As we know, crisis will often lead to innovation. How, in your opinion, can the industry fight back? What kinds of innovation or workarounds do you envisage or have you seen?
So far, I think it's too early to identify innovation. I think people are just scrambling to continue to get their projects going, to get the deliveries that they need. I think the first wave to hit construction was reports that items that they had ordered from China or from Italy, that those weren't going to be produced on time. So I guess if it counts as innovation, it's improvising, finding new supplier sources, perhaps substituting one material for another. And from there on, I think we will start to see redesign of facilities, rethinking of what kinds of things people need or what would make them safer if there is another event like this. One possibility is that we're going to see fewer people going into offices as we all learn to work from home. Those of us who had previously been in offices, it's likely that some employers are going to say, wow, we don't need to put up such a large building or rent so many floors, and instead more people will be instructed to work remotely. Beyond that, I think the university market is also going to be challenged. In the U.S., so many universities depend on tuition and philanthropy, and they're going to be suffering on those accounts. We also may see that fewer students are willing to cross the ocean or at least move far away from home if they wind up being stranded. So I do think there are various categories of businesses, of owners that will rethink what sort of construction they need. And that's going to force construction companies to adapt also.
Mm. Clearly, the landscape will look very different once the crisis has passed. We're not going to snap back into the world as it was. What kinds of differences do you predict?
There's no question this will be extremely challenging for construction firms, that they typically have relatively small cash reserves. We'll have to see what sort of relief governments come up with to keep companies afloat, but I'm afraid we're going to see a lot of companies go under, and so perhaps the industry will become somewhat more concentrated. Construction in the United States has always relied very heavily on small subcontractors, each with their own specialty, and to the extent that there are fewer of those to call on, I think it may mean that more projects are delayed, and perhaps it will take longer to assemble a team to do the sorts of mega projects that we had been seeing increasingly showing up in the market.
Thank you, Ken. Last question. What advice would you give those listening to this, both within the off-road vehicle industry, manufacture, and also the construction industry at large?
Well, first, for any business, any organization, people are your best asset, and obviously you want to do what's right to keep your workers and others that you're involved with safe, out of harm's way. It may mean huge sacrifices financially for the enterprise, but ultimately, if the enterprise won't survive if you don't have a workforce that is healthy and has faith in you. Beyond that, I think companies need to do whatever they can to preserve cash and preserve assets. Construction businesses, manufacturers, and the whole supply chain, they're very vulnerable in the sense that they have large physical assets that aren't necessarily easy to store or to guard. And in a time when movement is restricted and you may not be able to get all the people you want to show up at work, you really need to watch out for how you're taking care of your assets and also how you can use them once the crisis passes.
Ken, stay safe, and thanks so much for your time during what is clearly a challenging period for everyone.
You're welcome, Saul, and I hope things go well for you.
Thank you.
Sobering but honest thoughts from two well-respected industry insiders. A month is a long time in Corona land, so who knows where we'll be at next time. In the meantime, stay safe, stay indoors if you've been told to, and don't forget to stay in touch with us on Twitter at IVT_MAG, online at ivtinternational.com, and of course via this podcast. That's it from me. Until next time. The IVT podcast is a Mark Allen Group production. Please like and subscribe. If you're interested in appearing on the podcast, reach us via our website, ivtinternational.com, or email ivt